Welcome to A Delhi Love, Ishq Mohabbat Pyar, the podcast that treats Delhiwalas to captivating conversations on living and loving all things Delhi. Delhi is not just a place, it's a state of mind, an attitude that leaves a mark on everyone who visits or calls it home. I'm Yasmin Kidwai, your host, a documentary filmmaker, former municipal councillor, and at heart, the quintessential Delhi girl. I love how Delhi is both old and new at the same time. I value its history and heritage and love exploring the new aspects of the city we share. I'm no expert, but I grew up in the gullies here, enjoyed public service here, and just like you, shared a deep passion for Delhi's enigmatic soul. Together, let's embrace the delightful contradictions that make Delhi the city it is. After all, around every corner, there must be 1,000 dastans to share in this megacity of a million conversations. Delhi's liveliness can sometimes hide layers of memory and loss. Though Delhi's history has seen many painful incidents, none perhaps as enduring as the legacy of the Partition. This event divided the Indian subcontinent and left scars on the collective consciousness of people both sides of the border. For many residents of Delhi, the memories of Partition are not distant echoes, but very real and a part of everyday existence. Conversations keep them alive as stories pass down through generations. Photographs turn up in family albums, and cherished heirlooms rekindle memory. Today, we are meeting a chronicler who has tried to understand the past through the documentation of objects. These objects were things people chose to carry and keep as they migrated to places on either side of the border which divided British India. What do those objects mean? And what of objects left behind? That is the space in which Aanchal Malhotra excavates her stories, discovering loss, kinship, and forgotten voices, offering readers a profound glimpse into a painful collective memory.
I found that the learning of history, particularly Partition, which up till now for me had just been in my school textbooks, was not human enough. People think that Partition happened only on 14th and 15th August, 2 days, and then it died down, where obviously that's not true because the run-up to it was several months, several years in fact. You can be emotionally attached to the village that you came from, which is on the other side of the border, but feel equally nationalistic for the country that you chose to be a part of in 47. These can coexist. The researcher is not devoid of bias. We are not superhuman. It's going to come. You belong to a certain country, a certain religion, a certain class, caste. It's all going to come out either in your language or your mannerism. My oldest friend is 100. You know?
Welcome, Aanchal. So I hope you've seen the podcast.
I have.
Yeah.
Yes, I have. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so we had your father on one of the first episodes that we did, and we were talking about the bookstore and the family history. And Bahari Sons no doubt holds a significant place in Delhi's history and in the creative world, and I think in the heart of almost every Delhiite. How was it for you to be growing up surrounded by books?
I think when you're young, you don't really realize the significance of what it means to be from a book-selling family, because if books are all you know, and they were always readily available to us at home or, sitting at the shop with my grandfather, I would read a lot. I don't think you realize how much of a privilege it really is to have access to books. And I think only as I've grown older, I've realized what a landmark it is, what an institution it is, how far-sighted my grandparents and later my parents have been over the years. It's just an enormous, I feel very privileged because I grew up being a reader, which I think in ways is much better than growing up being a writer. I would choose reading over writing any day.
Even now?
Oh, especially now. Writing is hard. It's difficult. Reading is luxurious.
True.
And I think when you are a good reader, you will become a good writer.
That's what everybody says. That is.
It's the truth, though. It's the truth. So I think, I guess that the travel that comes with reading, the generosity of vocabulary that comes with reading, you were reading about places from all over the world, which you may or may not go to in your lifetime. And I think that was always encouraged. In fact, since I've been a kid, there was no other, it was like, oh, pick up a book, So I don't know, I can only describe it as it's the only upbringing I have known. But I know it's one of enormous privilege, and I would never trade it for anything. No.
But did you always want to be a writer?
Oh, no. No, because the other thing is when you grow up in a bookshop, you're surrounded by the greats on the shelf, and it's quite intimidating, and you never actually think, as a child, I never actually thought that I would have enough to say about anything that was important enough to put in a book. And I always grew up wanting to be an artist. That was what I wanted ever since I was a child, ever since I think I was 3 or 4 years old. And I was quite lucky that my parents encouraged that kind of creativity. So I ended up going to college to study traditional printing. I studied to be a metal engraver. And that's the only thing I have degrees in. So I have my bachelor's in fine art, my master's in fine art. And it was only, I think, towards the tail end of grad school that I thought I had something to say that could only be said in words and not images.
And what kind of brought this about at that point of time?
So when you do any degree in visual art, something that needs to be put in a gallery for viewers to see, whether it's a painting or a photograph or a print. In my case, it was traditional printing. So I was doing engraving, etching, lithography. When you come to a point where you have to work on a thesis, your thesis has to go up in a gallery space, but you have to write a little bit. And that's really not a lot. It's just a few pages. But and you can pick anything to do your thesis on as long as you pictorially depict it visually. I became interested in the Partition through a very specific lens. I was living in Canada at the time, and I had been for about 8 years. And 8 years is a long time in a young person's life to be disconnected to where you're from, in a way that you think that you can become a whole different person. And you don't realize that the things that fundamentally make you who you are, like the place that you came from, the language that you spoke, the history that has been evolving and growing even before you were born, you can't escape those things. So I was in my 3rd year of graduate school, and I was introduced to these objects that my mother's family had carried from Lahore to Amritsar before partition. And they were such mundane objects, I'd probably seen them so many times. It was a ghada, in which lassi was made in the house every Sunday, and a guz, a yardstick used to measure fabric. And they were such ordinary objects, but when my grandfather's eldest brother started talking about where they were from and how they were used, he evoked such imagery of this place called Lahore that I had never really associated myself with. It's complicated enough living in Canada, thinking of yourself as Indian, gradually becoming some form of Canadian, but then to add another layer of your history being further back than what you thought it was, and a very complex layer of a neighboring country.
Which one's in conflict with?
Constantly, and as someone that grew up in the 90s in the shadow of the Kargil war, that is at the back of your mind. But it really made me stop and think about the notion of belonging and origin, and how actually I don't have anything to connect me to the places where all 4 of my grandparents come from. It's not just one grandparent, it was 4 of them. So the entirety of your history is in a land across the border. And it was just, these are very big things for, someone who's like 21 years old or 22 at the time.
Were talking to your uncle in this context for the...
There was no thesis. He was just talking about it.
And this was when you were on a trip to India?
I was on a trip to India. And that's when I got an idea that I should really pursue this.
At 21?
I think it was 22, something like that. But I never really thought it would become as big as it did. And, and when you have such a generational gap from the people who have lived through something like partition, how do you bridge it? What are the questions that you ask? I didn't know that. All I had been trained in was, color theory and how to make images, how to observe the world. That's a visual training. So there was a lot of learning, but eventually I decided to work on the objects that refugees had carried during partition for my master's thesis. And that's when I think I really got involved, and eventually it just consumed my life, this world of partition.
And objects.
And, memory, language, belonging, origin, identity, multi-hyphenated identities.
But these are very complex terms to be, starting off. How did it? I'm sure it didn't start off.
No, like now I'm speaking with like a decade of hindsight. Yes. And when I listened to those first interviews that I conducted with people, I started in my city. I started in Delhi. Delhi's demographic changed completely after partition. It became largely Punjabi that we now identify Delhi as, but it was never like that. And so I wanted to understand the people who came from the areas that became Pakistan. Where did they live? What did they do? What did they eat? What did they wear? How did they feel? This is the feeling, the texture of feeling is a much larger question than any of these other mundane things. But eventually it was to understand the notion of belonging or being ruptured from a place of origin. How do you start these conversations? Which is where the object came in. If I say, you carry this ring from Malakwal, where my grandfather came from. Why did you carry this ring? Who told you? Okay, you carried it. Your mother told you to carry it because they thought they would have to sell it when they came to India. Okay. Well, can you tell me about these stones? Okay. Why didn't you sell it? What did you think was going to happen when you left your home? How did you hear about partition? Did you read about it in the paper? Did you hear about it on the radio? Did they tell you in school? What did you think it was? What did you pack? What did you bring? What did you wish you brought? So, but, as like someone who's in the early 20s, you're also learning how to ask these questions.
Yeah, like who's giving you this list of questions to ask? Yeah.
It's trial and error.
Yeah.
It's trial and error. Every interview taught me the threshold of my questioning because people are different. Some are more willing to share. Some have never said these things before. Others may meet you halfway and after an hour or so may say, "Ab bas ho gaya. I don't want to remember anymore." Some people would say things like, "I don't want to go into the details, but you can imagine it," right? So already there is an assumption that we, growing up in the subcontinent, have a visual vocabulary of what partition is. So even though me at the age of 22, 23 didn't know enough about it, mostly because I'm from a generation where we didn't have to know about it.
Now, what are you working at this point of time? And when you're talking about these interviews, you're working on your thesis, which you've chosen.
I'm working on my thesis, which I still think is going to be a visual thesis. So, in hindsight, I don't really know why I was doing all this in-depth research, but I felt like if I was taking photographs and making illustrations of objects, which is really what my end goal was at this point.
Yeah.
I thought that I needed to know the history and context of that object.
You were making illustrations of objects.
I was making photographs, I was making drawings, I was, picking up objects, looking at them, touching them, caressing them, the texture of the object, what the object evokes when it's in somebody's hand. See, on the onset, an object is just an object. The minute you start to give it history and context and personality and biography, it becomes...
And ownership, perhaps.
Exactly. It gives so much.
So can you just explain for our listeners who are probably this concept, just to explain the concept of recording oral histories of material objects and memories. What does it really mean?
Right. Oral history is the study of oral narratives about specific times in history, which means that you are learning about a historical period through the stories of people rather than through archival documents. This kind of history writing and history recording has its own drawbacks. And the most popular is that, well, how do you know someone is telling the truth? What is the veracity of this narrative that you've recorded? And while I acknowledge that, I also say that when we go into a library or an archive to refer to a document, that's also just another version of the truth that someone at some point in history has written from their perspective. It is also implicit of bias. It is not an unbiased document. So why are the narratives of your neighbor or your mother or your grandmother or your aunt or uncle not valid versions of another kind of truth? In fact, they must be read together. I found that the learning of history, particularly partition, which up till now for me had just been in my school textbooks, was not human enough. It reduced a person to a number, to a statistic. It diluted their identity, their very unique losses, their incredible sacrifices, the consequences of that journey. We didn't learn any of it. And I felt like I didn't want people like my grandparents to be reduced to a number, because they weren't. And I think that the oral history of partition is so complicated because it has so many sides. The Indian, Pakistani, later Bangladeshi, the English, within that several subgroups, several religions, ethnicities, linguistic groups, castes. They would all be telling different stories. At some point, these stories may converge. At some point, the same person may remember completely divergent things about their life. For instance, you can be emotionally attached to the village that you came from, which is on the other side of the border, but feel equally nationalistic for the country that you chose to be a part of in 47. These can coexist.
They're not contradictory.
They are contradictory, but they are coexisting in a person. And I don't think the person thinks they are contradictory. They just think it's the story of their life. This is how I feel. But inward feeling sometimes requires time and effort, particularly when there are things that really are formative to a person's being. So oral history, or at least how I started my process, was trying to understand the texture of feeling and allowing people the dignity of space to speak about their experiences in their own words, in their own language, how much or how little they wanted to talk about. And then it comes to material history, which is a whole other kind of historical writing about objects. For the most part, writing about objects has been reduced to, say, forms of museology, where the object is separated from us
through a glass window and comes across as very cold and distant.
Yeah.
We've all studied history, is that people are put in the context of when, there's excavation happens and there is people will be put, histories will be formed on the basis of objects which are found with people and the life.
Exactly.
A history of their, it's imagined, like you said, that what the life and times would be, what we're writing about. Now these objects are then picked up and put into a museum where we look at them separated by a glass, a glass thing which looks very distant. And here you are talking to people who's actually, it's a complete reversal, because they're actually carrying the object. So it's almost a reverse way of looking.
What I was interested in was the intimacy that they shared with the object, because not all objects are equal. Right? There's a hierarchy to the object as well. So if you go into an interview with somebody and they've carried jewelry, the likelihood of them remembering, bringing it out, putting it on, showing it off is very high. However, if you go into an interview with someone who's carried a case, now young people don't even know what case is, an ordinary blanket, right? A blanket from Punjab, hand-woven usually. It's not a very extraordinary object.
And would it be in usage?
So that's the other question. How are objects of history treated? Are they kept in cupboards? Are they used? Are they shared with younger generations? Are they used to tell the story of the place that they came from? More than often not.
Or is there is it a generalization to this? They can't be.
No, of course not. Nothing to do with people, nothing to do with humans can be general. Everyone is so different. This is one thing that I've been really conscious of, is to tell a single story is very, very dangerous because it homogenizes people, and there is nothing about Partition that was homogenous. Because people had such conflicting emotions. How much you could carry, how little you could carry, what that meant, how that was used, how that was sold, how that was saved. These are all testaments to that time that vary person to person, family to family. So when you're going into, I'll give an example. I went to speak to a lady who had walked from Quetta to Mussoorie as a child, very young child, with her family. Now, on the onset of that journey, her mother had taken one shawl, torn it in half, given one half to her sister and one half to her. It's a big shawl, their children, one half is enough. And they literally just wore it to keep warm because they were going from Quetta, which was cool at the time, to Mussoorie, which was also cool. And this shawl must have been in the back of her closet. It wasn't really extraordinary. It was of fawn color, Kashmiri, little kadai.
And it's torn.
There is a cut. You can see it's a jagged edge. But when I was speaking to her, she didn't really think that the shawl, it was just a shawl for her. An hour goes by, 2, 3, I think I spent 3 or 4 hours with her. At the end of, and we were talking about the object, the history, the family, how it was used. You see, the object is a portal to get to more, I suppose, cavernous subjects like family, like migration. Feelings, origin, belonging, home. All of those things you were talking about. Now, at the end of the interview, I said, "Can I borrow the shawl? Just for my research, I'll return it." And she says, no, it's mine. It was my mother's. She gave it to me, it's been with me for so long. It's mine. So that how in the course of a couple of hours, because of an external force that is obviously putting importance into that mundane object, how the value of that object changes.
How interesting.
It was fascinating, right? Whereas, like I said, things that were obviously valuable, like jewelry, the relationship is completely different. It's an heirloom, right? How does an object get these tags, these titles,
And how you attach value to a particular thing.
And what happens when an external person comes and puts so much importance into it? How then do you treat the object in your home? How do you pass it on? If you are a child or a grandchild of Partition and you've been lucky to inherit these stories, it's a rarity. And I really think those people are quite lucky because I was never told anything. It was never a word uttered in our house. And when I started asking about it, my grandparents thought it was very strange and very unusual. And in my grandmother's words, she didn't think anyone, her children or grandchildren, would even wonder about what a partition was. She didn't think anyone would study it, let alone become completely obsessed with it.
I also kind of feel on an off track. I think, the people who came, I can't speak of that side because I don't know the stories, but I kind of feel people who came into Delhi and they had to survive, and there was this entrepreneurial, this drive to survive, which is like your grandfather also. Perhaps they needed to put it behind them. They needed to move on. Perhaps
that's one way.
Yeah, and they didn't, they themselves didn't want to talk about it in the need to kind of move on and set up and make of their lives because they were restarting.
That's definitely a very valid, I've thought about this many times. The other thing I've come to realize is that they actually didn't know how to talk about it. No one was asking them questions. The vocabulary of Partition is still being formed. It's quite young. And it's ironic for countries like India and Pakistan, at least, that were born from such violence. We don't have a vocabulary of trauma. We don't have a vocabulary of that violence. We rely on popular imagery of trains and refugees huddled in, Purana Killa.
Like you also said that it's a mass history, and we don't look at, I myself come from a family like that, and I didn't realize, honestly, though,
that my grandfather had chosen to come from the other side over here. And till I read it in a newspaper article that he was one of the people who chose, one of the Muslims who chose India to choose.
The other famous one is Shah Rukh Khan's father.
So they were together.
Right.
So Shah Rukh Khan family and my family. So they came, so they were part of the red shirt movement.
Yes.
And because there was no conversation about it, the first time I read about it in a newspaper article.
Yeah.
And I was like, you do feel inadequate. And that you don't know anything about this, and
absolutely,
and because it was not talked about. It was
But I think also that's an interesting perspective, because then aspects of loyalty come in.
That's also true.
Yeah. I think this with a lot of Muslims that chose to stay in India, the aspect of loyalty to your land.
And which is also they have to constantly kind of being tested.
Exactly.
So perhaps that is as far
it is an equally valid perspective. I think people have a lot of misconceptions about partition. They think that partition happened only on 14th and 15th August.
True, that just two days.
2 days.
Yeah, it was over a period.
And then it died down, where obviously that's not true, because the run up to it was several months, several years in fact. And of course, some would say that partition has not normalized even now, because we're feeling the geographic but also emotional and generational repercussions. The other thing is, people think that only people who migrated have valid experiences of partition. This is not true either. To be in the place that you call your home and to watch it be engulfed in chaos, either through violence or migration, is an equally valid perspective. And I really felt while I was doing my work, these experiences should be recorded as well.
True, yeah. Just generalizing it, why is it that objects hold so much history for us and can become means of preserving memory? Like,
do they? I don't know. I found that like the Indian family is a hoarder of objects, but they don't necessarily.
The very great thing to link both these things. The Indian family is also, thankfully, till now, at least, also sits together and passes a lot of old stories, even if they're not recounting so much of, I think that kind of leads to, there is a cross-generational conversation which is still there in
I think that, yes, in some cases, I have seen, like in my own family, we didn't really talk about anything to do with the past until I started asking. So you do need someone.
But you had an opening to talk.
I made that opening in a very uncomfortable way. Because also, like, when you bring an event from the past that has not disrupted the present in a long time.
Yeah, you also don't perhaps want to do it.
Well, you think a lot about it, right? Like, so I remember my grandfather who started the bookshop. He wasn't really interested in speaking about this. And he would constantly say, well, his question was, if I tell you, what will it change in your life? What will it change?
In your life.
In my life. Now, how do I explain to him? Obviously, physically, nothing will change, but emotionally, intellectually, familiarly, everything will change. You see, it changes the way you love people.
How would you explain that?
In exactly these words.
But did you understand it at that time?
I think, you see, I didn't start with this grandfather. I started with my mother's family, who had already come to Delhi during partition, and they saw partition in a very different light. Then I moved on to other people before I came to my grandfather. And interviewing your family is the hardest. It is very hard. There are so many levels of intimacy that you have to, I don't know, like, encounter, and obstructions and just heaviness. Family is complicated. Family is complicated, And now all of a sudden you're not just a granddaughter, but you're a researcher, and you have to be objective, and they have to take you seriously. It takes a long time to establish that, particularly as a very young person. But I think for me, genuinely, I had to explain to him that you need to learn your history. It changes the way you view your present and your future. And I think I can say this now, like, children are quite cruel to their parents and grandparents, because we don't understand, like, we will make a fuss about their habits, what they tell us to do, how strict they are, how little they allow us. But we don't understand that all of these traits are actually products of their upbringing and their circumstance and their sacrifices, you know. And I never understood why my grandparents were so frugal, why my grandmother never threw anything away. It was like, well, you don't need this cloth, you don't need this dupatta. No, I'll make a dusting cloth out of it. You know, you don't really need this. No, I'll remove it from this and I'll put it on another piece of suit fabric, something like that. Always reusing, always recycling, never throwing away. But you don't understand that
and
it comes.
Appreciate it.
I mean, because your children, your world is so limited to like your school and your friends, और school से आके phone पे किससे बात करनी है हमने, और इतनी गर्मी है हमें आइसक्रीम खानी है, और but that's childhood, you know. And our parents' childhood was also like that. And then you realize, like now I realize that how much of my upbringing was actually a circumstance of my parents' upbringing and the circumstances of their parents' limitations as post-partition refugee families in Delhi, you know. And despite that, what an incredible life they were able to give their children. But when you're 21, these are not the words you're using, you know. These are not the things you're thinking. Yeah, I think a lot has changed for me also in the last decade or so. Yeah.
Tell me any special memory in your any special object which has a special memory that you were able to.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So many. Like my family carried very mundane things. Like my grandfather's family carried my Bhari son's grandfather.
Your paternal grandfather.
My paternal grandfather. His mother carried utensils. Because, I mean, just look at the foresight of the woman. Like, okay, we are going to a camp. We are going to, they had to leave their house in interior Punjab in a place called Malakwal. And they went to this camp that had been set up in a cotton factory. And she said, no, in Malakwal itself. They left their home and then they came eventually to Delhi. But she says, okay, we're leaving our home. We're going to a camp. They say they will provide ration. What will I cook it in? What will we eat in? She carried utensils, very आम जो plate, glass वगैरह होता है हमारा. That's what she, kadhai, you know. My grandmother, her mother carried a piece of jewelry that she would sell. She thought she would sell, but thankfully she didn't have to. My grandmother herself carried a small folding knife. हाथी दांत, ivory जिसको कहते थे उस जमाने में. She was from Dera Ismail Khan. And when she was growing up, there was already violence in the area. It was a predominantly Muslim area. They were Hindu family. There was already violence. So everyone in the house, young girls especially, got these tiny foldable knives that you put them in your pocket or tie them into your dupatta, wherever you go. She brought that to India because I think it was just on her person by habit. Now, when I found that object, it's incredibly rusted. It's very difficult to open. And I said, this thing used to protect you when you were a child. You carried it. This, and she used to carry lal mirch ka powder. Aankhon mein dal do, kisi ke. If an assailant tries to attack you, young women, they were told their honor is far more important than anything else. So, कोई आता है आपको अटैक करने तो आंखों में डाल दो उनके. Fine. So she says, I always used to carry this knife, and I said, now, what do you use it for? Like, she said, I use it to cut aloe vera in the garden. So, the lifespan.
Still using.
She used it until she died last year. Yeah. I have it now. She used it. Park में जाके वो aloe vera काटती थी, or she would cut her herbs or whatever, tulsi. The lifespan of an object is also very interesting. How it is used for a particular thing in a particular moment, and then its capabilities reduce or its usage becomes different depending on the time.
This is remarkably the first material study of the partition.
Of partition, yeah.
But I'm really surprised why nobody thought of doing this.
As was I. I think this is what I was saying, that Indian families, we are and not just Indian families, South Asian families, let's say that, because I've seen in Pakistan as well. We are hoarders of things. इतना सामान होता है हमारे घरों में, रखने की जगह नहीं है, पर फेंकना नहीं है हमने. However, we do not consider the object for its material value, its technical virtuosity, its beauty, its artistry. We don't think about who gave the object to us or why we bought it at a particular place or whether we're going to pass it on. Granted, okay, there's not enough time to think about these things. To do a project like this is also a privilege and a luxury. Okay. You know? Yes, I acknowledge that. But I think, I don't know why no one had seen the notion of objects as storytellers when it comes to partition. Because certainly such objects have been done in the past and have been done since as well. Just not in the case of partition. You know? So
did you have a reference point that you would do it like this, or did you
no
think that okay, this has been done and I'd like to do the same thing here in India?
No, I don't think what the references I had could be replicated. One book that really moved me a lot was Edmund de Waal's The Hare with Amber Eyes, where Edmund de Waal is a potter. He's an English ceramicist, which already I related to because I was a printmaker. We both worked with our hands. And he was bequeathed this set of netsuke. And netsuke are tiny little wooden figurines. They're carved as animals or people, tiny little.
From where?
Originally from Japan. But this is a great question that you asked, because that's the question he asked as well. He had inherited, I think, 600 of them. And he started, I suppose, running after the trail of where they had come from and where they had migrated to. How did they come from Japan, go to Vienna, then go to parts of England, and then reach him? And in the course of traveling through the story of these objects, it took him back to World War II and even further back to Odessa, where his family was from, and he was telling the history of migration through objects. In the context of World War II, which became a very big thing for his family because he's Jewish. And they were in camps. That cannot be replicated to an Indian or Pakistani or South Asian context, because partition is a very different event than the Holocaust. There is no clear perpetrator as there is in the Holocaust. And so I think the political context of the story of these objects was always going to be different. And I knew that I had to find my own voice, a more desi voice, of course, which is also reflective in, the manner in which I write, the manner in which we speak, when we speak in our languages and we speak in English as well, the words that we use, the vocabulary of partition, all of that would have to be something new. But of course, you had guides, Ritu Menon, Urvashi Butalia, Anis Kidwai.
You approached them.
Anis Kidwai is dead now, but I wish. The world of partition studies is not that big. And I think people like me can do what we do because people like Urvashi and Ritu did the things that they did in the 80s and 90s. We stand on their shoulders. So you have to go to them for advice. And I'm always just so grateful that rather than saying, oh, you're doing the same thing we did or similar things, they were incredibly generous till date.
I was going to ask, how did you find them?
Till date, I mean, I have no hesitation in saying that I do what I do because they did what they did, and they did with such ferocity. The first oral histories of partition were stories of women, which Urvashi, Kamla Bhasin, Ritu Menon, these three women. So there were places to start from, but I think that the skeleton of my project would have to be my own.
Was it always going to be a book when you started with it?
Oh God, no. No, because that's such a... I mean, does anyone really think that, I'm going to write it? No. And certainly not me. I didn't really think I had any talent for writing. That was genuinely the case. But when I started working on the thesis, I started thinking about the same question you asked me. Why were you recording all these stories? Obviously, there is something inherent in your mind that knows that the voice is integral to the object. The story is integral to the object. And after I defended my thesis, I was left with an enormous amount of field research I'd done about people. And I didn't think at that moment that the visual depiction of that journey was enough. I thought that the voice had to be more actively present. I had to write them down. Also, these were stories that I hadn't grown up hearing. They were stories quite different from the stories taught to us in school. There were perspectives far different. That's when I started thinking then it could be a book. But again, I didn't really think of myself as someone that had any talent for writing. But the thing is, you need the right subject for talent to be evident. Because if you have, it's not, true, I mean, it's just something,
when the passion combines, yeah.
It's just something that I have learned about myself, that I needed the right subject for me to know that I already had a vocabulary about it.
Yeah. You know, enough to say, perhaps.
Yes. Like when we are young, we read everything from Shakespeare to Wordsworth. Like, how do we think that we are ever going to match up to them? That's what I'm thinking. But they existed in a totally different time period, context, in a whiter environment. And I think we cannot emulate them. I am writing, I am thinking, I am feeling, I am researching for my people. And my people is Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. A subcontinent. That's my people.
You're right, because I was just, just listening to it, I was thinking that as a somebody who's trained in documentary filmmaking, that is how I would have thought of it, like, in terms of recording these stories and kind of putting them into some kind of film format, because perhaps, but you move beyond being an artist and
I had no talent for videography.
Maybe it's going to happen now.
I still don't think I have any talent for it. I have a talent for listening. I'm a better listener than a talker, and I think,
as all good documentary filmmakers,
I suppose, but that's also a trait that takes a long time to hone.
Yeah,
I don't think young people know how to listen.
Or have the patience.
They are always thinking about what to say next. How is my voice going to be heard over yours? Often people ask me how I think I use my fine arts education in this field, because I haven't been back in the studio for many years now. The one thing that gave me was the power of observation, which is so incredibly important for an oral historian, because you're recording what is being said, but you have to observe what is not said. The unsaid is as important as the said, because you see, memory doesn't always verbalize it. It exists in the body, it exists in the gestures.
You have to be a great observer.
Right. The smallest things, from where their voice changes to where language changes, when they move from one language to another, where they look out, where they cry, where they stop, where they pause.
So how does this process flow when you're sitting with somebody in an interview? Are you making notes at that
Yes, I'm making notes. I'm writing, of course, what they're saying. I'm recording, but I'm writing the important things. I'm making drawings. I am observing the change in their environment. But this also came with time. It's not like the first interview I did. Sure. I was like, this is my process. Let's go.
And I'm an oral historian now. When did it sink in that I'm an oral historian now? This is what I'm doing.
Good question.
I'm fascinated with it, because I still sometimes figure, struggle with how do I describe the work that what is it that I do? Am I, what am I doing? I'm listening to stories and documenting stories. I'm, working with culture. What is it that I'm doing? So I'm
trying to
I'm
think.
Appreciating that you could put it down, but it's nice.
I'm trying to think, when you have to write an author bio?
Yeah.
Right.
I know.
And an artist bio?
Or any bio.
Right. So I remember going through many iterations. Am I an artist and a writer? Am I a documentarian and an artist? Am I an engraver and a writer? And then I think you look at the people who have done work similar to you, and you see how they describe themselves, or they have been described. You understand that you now belong to a very small and unique group of people. because it's also easy to misunderstand journalism for oral history. Those are not the same thing. It's not the same thing at all. They're similar, they have overlaps, but I'm not a journalist. Right?
What's the difference?
I think in, of course, the time period we spend with our subjects, though that is also up for question because some journalists spend several years on a particular project. I think that the methodology may be a bit different, though I can think of journalists that follow similar methodologies. I think the way that we treat our interviewees is different. For me, an interview is not a transaction. Not to say that in journalism it is, but there is a quickening of your process in journalism because you have a deadline. So I have never been a journalist, so I can't speak in that regard. But I can think of journalists who have crossed into the realm of oral history. And I'll give you a really good example. A woman called Radhika Iyengar, who has been a journalist for many years, spent so many years with the Doms of Banaras, the Dom community that burned the bodies on the ghats of Manikarnika and Harishchandra Ghat in Banaras. And I know that it began as one of her earlier journalistic projects for a newspaper, and then she stuck with it. And then she came up with a book last year called Fire on the Ganges. And it is an excellent, respectful, dignified approach to a community that is so easily reduced to binaries often. And I think the manner and methodology of her interviewing, the dignity that she gives to her subjects, the time that she spends with them, the observation is all reminiscent of an oral historian. So that is someone I know has bridged that.
You know, I'm not going to push you about the title. No, but you refer to these conversations that you had with the subjects.
Yeah.
And, how did you kind of approach them? It's not easy to establish trust, and, there has to be a certain amount of time that you need to spend with the person to establish the trust. And I'm speaking from a documentary filmmaker's experience. There's a space you need to negotiate because you can't spend too much time also, because then you're not, you kind of can, there is a fear of losing your objectivity. There is also the challenge of how do you accurately tell the story without becoming too familiar with that story. How did you negotiate that? How much time, was it a typical amount of this thing that you gave to each person? And it also depends on how much time they are willing to give you. And, you are entering their homes, which are very, very private spaces, and then you're going further into their space of memory. And it's almost like intrusive. People,
I've used that word before.
Yeah, and it's, frankly, it could have been it would have been very tough on you also. From the other point of view also, because these are not pleasant experiences that you're talking about. I've put in too many things. I'm just imagining you in that space and asking my question.
Let's start with, how do you get the interview?
Yeah. How did you find the subjects? Was it through your grandparents helped?
It started like that. Okay. Because don't forget, I was in my early 20s. How does someone so young know people in their 70s, 80s? It's not like that's my preferred, friend circle at that point. Though I would say 10 years down the line, it most definitely is. I relied on people that my grandparents knew who had also migrated at the beginning. Which meant that it was going to be a certain kind of migrant from West Punjab who came to Delhi, likely lived in the camps. My grandparents lived in Kingsway camp. They met there. They met there.
Both the sets?
No, my paternal side, the Barison's grandparents. They met there, and so it should also tell you that partition is not always just about violence or suffering. These kind of very beautiful things can emerge from the landscape that division created. Then the other people I relied on were my mother and my father, because they have this incredible bookshop that hundreds of people come to every day. And it would be as simple as my mother interacting with an older customer saying, oh, by the way, are you originally from Pakistan? Would you like to speak to my daughter? She's doing this project, so it's very, I don't know. My mother has this social ability that I don't have. I am an introvert. I know right now I'm talking a lot about myself, but that doesn't come to me naturally. And I find it quite difficult, at least at the beginning, to just go up to people and ask them. But my parents, my mother, my father, they both have this incredibly social ability to not only do it in a very elegant way, but also make the person feel, comfortable.
I agree. Having met your
Yes.
mother and your father,
Yes.
I have to agree
Yes.
with that.
So they were of enormous help. Anyone who picked up a book on partition, also they would say, oh, that's interesting. Do you have any personal history? Would you be interested in speaking to my daughter? Then my aunt, my mother's sister, she is like the biggest supporter. My Masi, she would go for a walk in the evening in Defense Colony, and any of the elderly people she met, she'd be like, are you from there? Do you want to talk to her? She set up a lot of interviews for me. And then I think that this process can only happen organically, where you speak to one person, they say, oh, would you like to speak to this other person I know? Or maybe you can speak to my sister. Acha, I have a neighbor that I think you could speak to. But keep in mind, I was looking for objects, which is harder than just recording memory. Because memory is more difficult to exhume without the object sometimes. So it was always one person led me to another person, led me to another person, led me to another person. When you're in the interview itself, what do you say? I think that was...
You're an introvert at that time.
I still am. I still very much am. But I've made, there is a difference between being an extroverted introvert for professional reasons and an introverted introvert for personal reasons. I'm very happy with my own company, but I know that the work that I do requires me to make other people comfortable. And I think this is, it's very basic tenet of humanity. Especially when you're speaking to someone who is not of the same class or the same caste or the same background as your own, and you want to understand their story, you have to treat them as dignified people, right? All of these things, though,
all the stories, and you have to make them feel the story is worth listening to. You can't be hurrying up this.
So this is a very important point you raise. When it comes to partition, particularly for people, let's say, who either had to get over it very quickly, were made to get over it very quickly, or people that were living in camps where everyone around them had witnessed the same thing, to tell them that your story, your individual story, your individual voice matters, even though no one may or may not have asked you or recorded you. It matters to me. It will matter when I write it, and it will matter to the people who read what I write. So you need to tell me how much or how little you want to. I think this is a big milestone in the interview, where you see where the story does matter to you, and you have to make people believe that it does matter.
The value of it has to be for it. They have to understand it.
Exactly. But I'm obviously I'm wary of using words like value or validity, or, because it then means that earlier there was no value in that story. But when I was in the interview with people, there are many, you realize really what a different generation you are from. Because in the earlier interviews, I can hear myself speaking mostly in English, hurrying to the questions that I want to ask, not understanding that actually there is time, trust that needs to be developed, pauses that are equally as important, language, of course. The language of the past is often the language of childhood, which is more than often not English. So becoming comfortable in things like Hindi and Urdu and Punjabi. All of these things come by doing interviews only. Like, there's no way you will be perfect on the first try. And even after you do hundreds of interviews, you'll realize that the threshold of your questioning is different with each person. Right?
Yeah, it's almost you're as good as the last interview, not that you do. it's because every interview is a new space. You're dealing with another human being.
The other thing is, elderly people, they have a lot of tributaries in their stories. It's never going to be about what you just asked. It'll be, okay, yes, this happened. But I was thinking that when I was 15, this also happened. And then we went here and, there's always some kind of meandering. And I learned to accept that and gently bring them back on track when we were really getting off track. But sometimes those meanderings add to the story. You realize that memory is not chronological. Remembrance is not easy. Forgetting is as important as remembering. Forgetting is sometimes a defense mechanism. And I think that experience comes with time, Yeah.
Now, by this time when you're doing this, you've shifted back to India and decided to shift back?
No.
You still...
I did a year of interviewing in India, 2013, which meant I was 23. Then I went back to Canada and I thought, okay, well, that's done. I can write my thesis. I can put it all together and I can defend it. And I had spent a year in India, so I took a sabbatical year. And then it really quickly dawned on me that all the interviews that I had were of people who had migrated and come to India. But that's one side. That's one side. I said, okay, well, now I need to go to Pakistan. So I went to Pakistan, did some interviews there. Mind you,
Where did you go in Pakistan?
I have been to Lahore and Karachi, Katas, Malakwal, Mandi Bahauddin.
And this was not one trip?
Not one trip, several trips. So then I did those interviews in Pakistan and I came back and I said, okay, now I'm going to work on the thesis. And then I defended my thesis and there was no plan of writing anything even then. It was all just for the visual thesis. Then I think I moved back to India in 2016.
There's also a UK, this thing, you have spent and did stories over there.
Exactly. 2015, 16, I did some stories in the UK, but more importantly, I think I was interested in seeing how people who were born in the Raj in India viewed partition. Because that's another very complicated landscape. We often omit the English person from consequences of partition. For good reason, but there are certain exceptions to be made there. People who were born here, people who had relationships with people here, who really consider India their home.
Yeah, I've been looking at some history like that and I kind of feel that it's been quite unfair to them.
Well, fortunately, an incredible writer and oral historian, Kavita Puri, wrote that story in a book called Partition Voices. And she is from Britain. So her perspective is the British voice, whether that be brown or white.
And when was this written?
I think it came out in 2018.
Because just in fact, this exhibition is currently on. It's about women as singers in the era of the
yes. Gauhar Jahan and all. Yes,
yeah. So Gauhar Jahan is not an Indian. She is her father is Armenian, her mother is Anglo-Indian, and that Anglo-Indian mother is trained in classical music. Who has taught her? To really just even just knowing there is Gauhar Jahan who was singing in a gramophone at that time is fascinating. The other part we don't even...
Yeah, exactly. The homogenization of identity is very convenient.
Yeah.
But for a person who has lived with that identity and grapples with those hyphens in it, it's very complicated. I did an interview several years ago with a young man who is from Pakistan but is Hindu. Throughout our interview, he kept saying, I'm a Pakistani Hindu. And throughout the interview, I kept saying, oh, as a Hindu Pakistani, And I repeated it several times, and then I think 3 or 4 times I said it, and then I paused mid-interview, and I remember when I was transcribing, I was listening to myself, and I said, you're saying Pakistani Hindu, and I'm saying Hindu Pakistani. Those are two different things. Your primary identity is of your nationality, not your religion. Whereas I'm conflating it because do we share the same religion? That's why I don't know. And then I clarified and I corrected myself. But, these small things, you have to be very attentive to them because it means things to people.
I was going to ask you, and it's come up like this. The stories of Partition, obviously, it's not a single story. There are stories on both sides. How did you avoid a personal bias to kind of come in?
You can't. You accept it by this. But I mean, I just admitted it.
Yeah.
The researcher is not devoid of bias. We are not superhuman. It's going to come. You belong to a certain country, a certain religion, a certain class, caste. It's all going to come out either in your language or your mannerism. You have to check yourself all the time. That's why the unlearning is as important as the learning. And when this happened with this young man from Pakistan, I thought to myself, well, I can ignore it altogether or I can put it in the book. So in my second book, actually, I've put it exactly how I told you. It's very important to let people know that you are not devoid of these biases, these prejudices. It makes you human. You can't help it. You can only learn.
And constantly.
Constantly. Every interview has to be some form of learning and unlearning.
Yeah, how was, this, we spoke about it a little earlier also, that when you were, the conversations are obviously of a deeply personal nature, and they're not going to be pleasant, many of them. Did you feel overwhelmed at any point of time?
Constantly. I think at the beginning you think, oh, this is interesting. Okay. And then you do another story, and then another story, and another story, and you think, okay, it took a whole different turn. Suddenly you are holding on to people's very private, very intimate, very formative things. And what do you do with that knowledge? How do you put it across? You asked a question about how ethically, responsibly to put across stories. This is why I said that the interviewer is not transactional, because for me, it's really important to keep in contact with this person. After I write the story, oh yes, I know them, I know their children, I know their families. Many have died. I've gone to visit them in graveyards, and yes, of course. Chauthas, everything. When I write the story and before it's going to print, it's really important for me to share the story, whether it's an old person or a young person, to say, can you read it? And this is how, because, the interview may not have been in English, which means that you have to translate it into the language of your writing. And you don't want certain things to be so dramatically lost in translation, though there will always be. They're not the same words. So every single person in any of my books has read their stories. If they haven't been able to read it, then I've read it out to them. And they have said, yes, this is it, or no, please change this, or actually this name is wrong, can you correct this? And with the older people, we were speaking about the validity of stories earlier, or them feeling the story is important. When you go to an elderly person and you take this printout and say, okay, this is for you, you can read it. I remember I did this to somebody once. And I was going to leave, and he said, wait, sit, let's just read it. And I said, no, that's for you to keep. You read it, you get back to me. And he said, no, I'll do it right now. So he's sitting and he's reading, and he's nodding as he's reading. And he's saying, yeah, actually, yeah, this is how it was. This is exactly, yes, this is how it happened. And I said, yes, because these are your words, that's how you said it. And he said, no, this is exactly how it happened. So it means something, Often people, this guy told me, I had interviewed his grandmother, and he said that, anytime someone comes into the house, she says, have you read that book? My story is in that book,
Okay.
It means something. But as you're collecting stories, you don't really realize how you are changing as a person, especially if you're doing it on an everyday basis. For me, like from 2013 to 2017, and even after, I was recording stories on an everyday basis because I realized that generation is dying, and it is the last real direct thread we have to that event.
But clearly, for you also, it's a project, defined by passion and a lot of commitment to give so much time, and like it's almost a privilege. It's not easy to be doing.
It's a privilege to be sitting with anybody and listening to their stories,
and then for them to allow you.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think
did you find it overwhelming most of the time?
Oh no, not when I'm listening to the stories with them. No, I found it overwhelming when I was listening and transcribing.
Do you feel a need to keep an emotional disconnect? No. Like somebody's telling you a story and you get kind of lost in the story and you're empathizing with them, and then you're an observer or you become a part of the story.
I'm very careful not to be that way. This is what I was saying, that when you're sitting with someone, you're urging them to speak as much or as little as you want. Yes, of course, you have to be emotional because you're not a stone. And you don't want them to think that you're not feeling what they're saying, but you can't embroider yourself into that story at that point. Now, I know researchers who become quite emotionally involved in the story, and that works for them, and they have written some phenomenal pieces as a result of that. Anam Zakaria, Pakistani oral historian, just someone I respect so much, and I constantly am learning from her. She has written Footprints of Partition. She's written this great book, 1971, Being a Pakistani Writing About Bangladesh. Now, all these questions you ask about bias and prejudice and how people view you, how emotionally attached you get, I really admire the way that she maneuvers through it. And she's not emotionally distant. She is involved. But I personally am a little bit removed because I think in that moment, you want to record as much as you can. When I'm listening to the recording and transcribing, that's when I think I really feel like I'm getting involved in it, because you're listening again and again to the same thing, and you're kind of weighing those words. You're listening to the words that they're using, and you're thinking about where that word has come from. So it gets very heavy. I'm a heavy person. I can't help it. There's no lightness in me, and I feel quite envious of people my age who move in the world with a very light touch. I'm not that person. It makes it very difficult also to have interpersonal relationships with people your age, because you have accumulated thousands of voices in your head. And of course, like, I don't know, you have to mature so much faster.
Choice.
Yeah, like my oldest friend is 100. That's not.
Yeah, how many people can say that actually?
Yeah.
But do you think that storytelling like yours, it plays a role in fostering cross-cultural understanding, especially between countries like let's just take the example we're talking, India and Pakistan, who have this context of conflict. Does it help to have your books been received well?
Very well. But there will always be people who don't want such histories written. I find that I am interested in the long run. I am not interested in my book selling out the day it hits the shelves. That's easy fame. It doesn't interest me at all. I'm interested in 10, 20 years later, if someone says, I want to read a really good book on partition, someone that really understands what happened. And someone says, oh, have you read her books? That's it. I want that. I want my work to have a legacy. I want the people who have spoken to me to be remembered. They're just ordinary people, like your father, my grandfather, your grandfather, neighbor. Those are the people that I spoke to. They are just ordinary people. but they have extraordinary stories, and I want their stories to live on for longer than they have, to live on for longer than I will. And I also think whenever India and Pakistan have a kind of reconciliation commission, because I don't know if it will be in my lifetime, but whenever it happens, the people who have lived through the conflict will not be alive anymore. And the stories that I have recorded, and Urvashi has recorded, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, Anam Zakaria, Kavita Puri, the stories that we have recorded will serve as first-hand testimony. It is what will be used in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. That's it. It obviously, right now I can see the impact that it has on younger people. Collectively, our works have affected the way people see each other across the border, where someone may read a story and say, someone from Pakistan may read a story of an Indian and say, wait, actually, my grandmother had the same experience. And that's the case with objects also, When someone sees an object that's been carried, let's say someone from Bangladesh sees like a ghada, the ghada that my family carried from Lahore to Amritsar, and says, my family carried that from Chittagong to Calcutta as well. Same. So how similar? Same. And I feel it reduces people then to certain democratic commonalities. And I don't know, it makes the other feel less like the other.
Lovely. I really hope the legacy of what you're hoping to create, I hope.
But it's not a singular effort, right? Like it's so many incredible people, writers, and this is why I think it's these are the people I turn to advice as well, like for advice, because they understand. They're the only people who understand.
And what I really hope is that more people come in and try to look at it from other points of view. There are still so many stories.
Yes.
And there are still so many ways of telling those stories.
Yeah.
We acknowledge the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful. Like you said, there's stories of love, there's stories of sadness, and I hope I think there's scope.
So many. I want to tell you about another person, Nina Sabnani, who is an educator. She taught in Ahmedabad for a long time now. She's in Bangalore. She's an animator and illustrator. Many years ago, she made this animated film called The Stitches Speak, about the women of Kutch who had come from Pakistan. And what they do is, they're desert folk. They embroidered the stories of their migration into the desert into the textiles that they make. And it's incredible because it tells you that the language of migration is not and cannot only be verbal. It is gestural, it is embroidery, it is song. So many different things. Right?
True. So lovely to have you, and
Thank you.
I kind of feel we could have gone on speaking for a much longer time, but perhaps we have you back again and we talk some more about Delhi, and specifically we can talk about Delhi and its,
I would love that.
Its oral histories.
Thank
you so much, Aanchal, for
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Aanchal's work brings us voices we would not have heard before and makes loss, memory and longing real in a very personal way. We hear the stories of seemingly ordinary people that help us understand a time we were not a part of, and it makes the history of partition human once more. And that is what we want to do with the Delhi Love, tell human stories. We speak to people from Delhi who have stories to share, stories of those who are invested in the city. We hope to help build communities and open conversations that make Delhi more accessible, welcoming and adventurous. Join us next time as we explore Delhi's hidden gems, people, places and stories on Delhi Love, Ishq Mohabbat Pyar. I'm Yasmin Kidwai. Until next time.